Our topic is guaranteed income for growth, question mark. Now, I'm sure many of the people here in the audience might have heard of basic income, the idea that is the government guarantees minimum income that is going to be paid to all individuals unconditionally and on a regular basis. What it means, people get free money and they can live without working. And it sounds very good idea if it really becomes the reality. So here in Switzerland, 2 years ago, there was a national referendum on basic income. And currently in Finland, they are undertaking pilot program. And I'm sure there are another pilot program being done in other parts of the globe. And in the United States, more and more business leaders, especially in Silicon Valley, expressing their support for basic income. So what we ask today is why basic income now, and what is this surge of current discussion of basic income? And will this idea really lead us to better and brighter future? And to discuss this issue, we have excellent panel here, starting with my right, Mr. Professor Guy Standing, and he is a professor of London University of London. And he is an honorary co-president of the organization called Beyond. Is it correct in that pronunciation?
Yes,
Beyond.
you're doing well.
Basic Income Earth Network.
Correct.
Right, and he's been actively promoting this idea for a very long time. And next to him, Mr. Stuart Butterfield. He's the founder and CEO of Slack in Silicon Valley. Now, Slack is, of course, the very extensive and very innovative software program that you can communicate very effectively. And it's expanding quite a lot, and you have now 6 million active daily users over the globe. It's great. And he has expressed his support for basic income on Twitter. And Mr. Sato, he is a president and a group CEO of Mizuho Financial Group, which is the largest financial group in Japan. And he's been a member of government committees for sustainable economic growth. And last but not least, Dr. Minouche Shafik. Right? She is a director of London Economic School and political science. Yes. And she was also deputy governor for the Bank of England. And she published a report on social welfare system, and you propose actually some ideas and proposals for that. And for this session, we're going to first ask each panelist what their position is, and we want to know, what everybody think about the basic income. So starting with the Professor Standing, you've been studying this issue for more than 30 years, and recently you're receiving a lot of attentions. See? And I wonder what's happening. What do you say?
Well, I first became convinced that we need to move in the direction of a basic income back in the early 1980s, when the neoliberal economics became dominant and the pursuit of flexible labor markets. It seemed to me then that this would result in growing inequality, growing economic insecurities, and the growth of a group of what I've called the precariat. That has accentuated over the years. Millions and millions of people are in the precariat, facing chronic insecurity. And for a long time, people regarded people who are proposing basic income as slightly utopian or slightly, off the board. But in the last 5 years in particular, suddenly there's almost a perfect storm of factors that have come together, which has made a lot of people, some of those you've mentioned and a lot of others, say, look, we've got to move in this direction. and I emphasize moving in this direction, okay? Not overnight, but we've got to. And the first factor is that the income distribution system of the 20th century has broken down. I wish more people would be facing the reality of that in Davos. We know that more and more of the income is going to capital and less to labor. More and more is going to the rentiers. That's why I've written a book on rentier capitalism. And the insecurities at the bottom are growing. And our existing welfare policies have not been succeeding. We've been moving to means testing, behavior testing, and all of that. So that's the first factor. The second factor, of course, is the fear of the robots. And that is why a lot of the Silicon Valley people, those you've mentioned, have been supporting basic income. We'll come back to that, but I'm a little skeptical about that version. But what I am convinced about is that the technological revolution we're undergoing is increasing the insecurities and the disruptive inequalities. And the third thing, which I think has become very relevant for Davos and for all of us, which is that if you have growing insecurity for millions, it's no use having economic growth if a lot of people are being left insecure and detached from the benefits, and if global warming is worsening and that growth is merely polluting the atmosphere. And we need a different type of trajectory. And I've warned in several books that if we don't address these issues, we're going to see the emergence of what I called a political monster, a growth of populism, neo-fascist responses to the insecurities. And the existing systems are not providing it. So a lot of people are now becoming open to it who might not have been as open as before. So I think we have this perfect storm of factors, and I'm delighted in some respects. And my book on basic income, I've traced through all the advantages.
Okay, we'll talk about your book later.
Yeah.
So in Silicon Valley, you hear other big names like Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, and of course you're a big name too, and expressing your support. What makes you think that way?
Well, to the extent that I'm here as a representative of Silicon Valley, I'm probably a poor one, because I think I share the skepticism, Professor Standing, about the prospects for robots replacing any number of net jobs over the long term. But I am very interested for political reasons, and I would say that my position overall is enthusiastic supporter of experiments, because it's very difficult to make any real accurate predictions about macroeconomic policy changes. So economists' track record is probably 99% incorrect when you put some narrow bands on the accuracy. And that's not because they're stupid, it's because it's very, very difficult when there's recursive loops and positive feedback and all kinds of consequences which are very, very difficult to predict. I would say that I share Professor Standing's concern about the what he calls the precariat, what I've sometimes called the economically vulnerable. And as the imbalance in the US and in Canada, where I spend some of my time, has increased, the predatory behavior has likewise increased. So you see people who have ill-paying jobs at fast food restaurants who have no option are then paid with a prepaid debit card, which has a very high transaction fee, like 75 cents or $1 per transaction. So their already very low wages are squeezed because they're not participants in the traditional banking system. The hypothesis for me is that with the minimum amount of support, those people would be able to make better choices and or be in a better position to negotiate relationships with employers that are less predatory.
I see. That's interesting. Mr. Sato, now, as in Japan, we know basic income has not been widely discussed as we see in Europe and the other places. As a Japanese business leader, what's your idea on this?
I think it's quite obvious inequality issue is one of the most important issue to be resolved for the sustainable growth and global basis. But I basic income discussion has just started in Japan, but not so active as you have said. Even if there is the inequality issue in Japan, for instance, relative poverty ratio, that was the 2015 figure, but is still 15.6%, which is not so big, but which is not so small. And especially child poverty, relative poverty ratio is 13.9%, which is a big number, I think. But even though the basic income discussion is not so active, there are two reasons of that. I think one is that in Japan, the redistribution function from the government of the income would be quite successfully enacted. For instance, talking about the Gini indicator, now we have just about 28 points, but originally the number is 48. So which means that because of the redistribution function from the government, we can reduce the number from 48 to 28. Successfully conducted. That's one of the reasons why. And the second one is that talking about the total security, social securities, about 40% comes from the pension, and 20% is for medical treatment. Just less than 10% is for the wealth. So which means that almost all Japanese persons are pretty much focusing on the pension and the medical care. That's the second reason this discussion is not so active in Japan.
Okay, now we talk about United Kingdom, Dr. Shafiq. I heard that there are some political parties who are actively debating on the basic income, but in your report you said, you pointed out some shortcomings of basic income. Am I right?
Yes, I mean, I think universal basic income is a very interesting proposition for developing countries. And when I was at the Department for International Development, we actually implemented such schemes where there was direct cash transfers to poor households in countries as varied as Ethiopia, Pakistan, Malawi. And in those cases, there's very clear evidence that providing income transfers directly to poor households really improves their circumstances. Nutrition goes up, they're able to keep their children in school, they're able to develop small businesses. And so I think for low and middle income countries that do not have a good welfare state and who are able to finance these cash transfers through progressive taxation or by eliminating very inefficient things like energy subsidies, I think cash transfers of basic income can be an important part of reducing poverty. But I think for advanced economies, which have a welfare state and are able to direct resources to those who are more needy, I think basic income is quite an expensive proposition. The IMF has done some recent estimates. If you had a basic income which was not very large, say a quarter of average income, 25% of average income in the country, in the average advanced economy, it would cost about 6.5% of GDP. Now, 6.5% of GDP is a very big number. And I can't think of many countries who have the fiscal space to spend 6.5% of GDP more. So it would probably come at the expense of existing welfare spending. And I think it's very hard to argue that that would be an efficient allocation of resources. Now, having said that, I think there are some big problems with our current welfare states that we need to fix, and that can be another part of the discussion to cope with the modern economy. But I think for advanced economies, there are better solutions.
I see. Well, I'm sure you have something to say that, but now we now know everybody's idea on this, and I gather two big trends behind the discussion of recent discussion of the basic income. One is widening inequality happening all over the world, and the second one is the future of job, and in the future where probably job is going to be replaced by technology, and then this worsen the security and stability of the society. And now I want to focus on the first important aspect, which is widening inequality. And as I explained, the basic income is going to be paid for all individuals and unconditionally and regularly, and three key factors. So what do you think is the most important factors or advantages of basic income?
I believe in moving towards having a basic income as the anchor of the income distribution system for three reasons. And they're all ethical reasons.
Ethical reasons.
Ethical reasons, not economic reasons. The first ethical reason is a matter of social justice. The wealth and income of all of us in this room and listening to this is far more due to the efforts of our ancestors and generations of generations that created the wealth, even for the Bill Gates of the world, even for you and me, than anything we do ourselves. And in a sense, if you allow for private inheritance of wealth, then you should have a sort of social dividend as a social distribution. That doesn't necessarily mean that the basic income as the social dividend that's handed out is equivalent and to be enough to give you coverage for all your basic needs. That's the first point. The second thing that I believe our existing welfare systems impinge on freedom. And I believe in freedom. And I think a basic income and moving in that direction would enhance individual freedom and what we call Republican freedom. The ability to say no. The ability to realize that you don't have to be dominated by people with unaccountable power. And that freedom is extremely important, and we've been losing that. And it's very important for the precariat. And the third reason is that we need basic security. We know from the psychological research that people who are insecure lose their IQ. Their mental bandwidth shrinks. Their ability to make strategic decisions, their ability to be altruistic and tolerant and cooperative all diminish. Whereas we have found with our pilots and other research, if people have basic security, the opposite, the good features of personal behavior. So I think those are very, very important. And I think one has to realize that it's not so much poverty. You can deal with poverty in many ways, right? You can even deal with inequality in many ways. But the real need is to appreciate the need for security. And here we have in Japan, there are some estimates now that put up to 50% of the adults are in the precariat, suffering from insecurity, not necessarily poverty. In Britain, a vast proportion of the labour force who are in full-time jobs are not earning enough to give them subsistence. In full-time jobs. And our welfare system has not covered for that. In the United States, it's very similar. So you can have growth and yet growing insecurity, growing homelessness, and all of these things. So we've got to realize we have a crisis of insecurity. And I believe a basic income will help address this problem, and it has many other virtues that we may come back to.
I see. But when we talk about the basic income, everybody has a different idea of how much to be paid to everybody. So what's in your mind?
In my mind, we've done experiments and pilots. We've done phenomenally successful pilots in developing countries, and I agree totally. The irony there is 10 years ago, when we used to talk about basic income, a lot of people would say, yeah, you can do it in rich countries, but you can't do it in developing countries. Now we have to face the opposite statement. Yeah, you can do it in developing countries, but you can't do it in rich countries. If you think about it, that doesn't make sense. We can do it in any type of country if we have the will. And I think the capacity to pay for it does not mean you have to eat away at benefits for the disabled or your national health service or things. Britain, for example, gives out billions of pounds on subsidies to corporations and to the wealthy. Okay, on tax reliefs, over 400 billion. You could easily afford it without eating away at your welfare system.
So how much approximately?
In my view, sorry, Apologies for
Yeah.
that. But my view is that we should start at a low level, and as the funding, I believe in a sovereign wealth fund approach, so that like the Alaska Permanent Fund or the Norwegians have done, where you gradually collect rental income and you build up the funding. So you would start at a very modest level. What we did in India was a third of subsistence, but it makes a huge difference, even a relatively small amount.
I see. But you're not going to dismantle all the other social networks.
No, I think gradually you would move away from means testing,
I see.
which is very important. We have to move back from means testing. In Britain, we have a terrible, cruel outcome for means testing called universal credit. And I promise you, you're going to see an increase in suicides, an increase in mental breakdowns, an increase in homelessness. By going means testing, you have to do behavior testing. Then you have to do more conditions because the other conditions are not tight enough. And you gradually move towards a workfare state where you've eroded the freedoms of people to a horrible extent. And that is the reality at the moment.
What he said he said it's better to start with a modest amount, but you said that it's going to be a very expensive project. And what do you think you should do? Because you said some shortcomings on existing models too. What do you suggest to improve?
Instead. Well, I think there are many other policy options which I think would be more effective and more efficient. So, for example, I think wage subsidies are a very attractive option. Some people call it negative income tax, so that if you are a low-wage worker, the state should top up your income so that you have a decent standard of living. You could raise the minimum wage. You could change your tax system so that you tax capital more relative to labor, for example. You could look at things like increasing the ability of trade unions to negotiate on behalf of workers. There are a whole array of policy options that one could look at that would be more focused on low-income workers. And I'm also very affected, frankly, by the research that's been done on what makes people happy. And the research on well-being and happiness says that there are three things that make people happy: having good relationships, having good health, and having meaningful work. And I think if we can increase the meaningfulness of work and make it more rewarding, I think we're going to get better social outcomes.
I see. Mr. Sato, I'm sure you're not convinced by basic income yet. Could you tell us more in detail? I mean,
Yeah. I think I'm a bit skeptical. There are 3 points that we have to discuss and consider. One is that the impact to the fiscal resource. That's one of the very important issues. And I think we distribute the same level of the money to the everybody. So in order to have the current balance of the fiscal resource, we have to charge more from the rich. Otherwise, the fiscal resource should be included. But in order to get more tax from the rich, because of the introduction of the basic income, would be politically very difficult, I believe. And also, for the ordinary person, it looks like the rich people might be able to have the similar level of money, which creates some philosophical or how can I say the mind of the disagreement to do that, even if the tax treatment may be able to remedy the kind of the difference. That's a reality. So that's the one point. And second point we may discuss later on, but this basic income may create the kind of reduction of the incentive for work. Let's discuss later on. Thirdly, as he described that it might be able to useful to use this basic income as an anchor of the social security, because as I mentioned in the case of Japan, the 40% has been used for pension, 20% for medical. So welfare is just less than 10%. I think basic income might be used just for the slight and anchor system for the social security. That's my feeling. That's why I'm a bit skeptical.
okay. Now, one of the reasons, as he mentioned, is financial matters, financial concern, and I mean, Dr. Shafiq also mentioned that it's very expensive, and I think the people here, a lot of people concerned, are we going to pay for that? Do we have enough money for that? And I wonder how you can address that issue.
I think we've got to open up that debate. I mentioned briefly in my last comment, most governments, I think probably every government represented in this room, pay out billions of yen, pounds, euros, dollars in subsidies. Subsidies are always bad economics. They encourage distortions, they're regressive, usually they increase inequality. In Britain, there are 1,100 forms of selective tax reliefs. The total amount of income foregone by that is over £400 billion. The cost of a basic income of a modest level is a fraction of that.
Fraction of that.
Yes, much less than that. And that's just for starters. I think we have to realize that we have to set up capital funds, democratic funds, like the Norwegians have done, where you gradually build up the capacity to pay out a decent income. Now, take wage subsidies. We've had wage subsidies in the forms of tax credits, earned income tax credit. You encourage low wages. It's the Spinamlum system all over again. Basically, what you do is you can say to an employer, don't worry, you can pay low wages because it's going to be topped up. If you pay low wages, you don't encourage technological efficiency, productivity improvements, because you're underpaying a key factor of your production. So what we found with tax credits and things, a large proportion of the tax credits go to employers. The benefits go to the employers. But you keep down wages. And that's what the lesson of the Spinamlum system was. So to me, that route is closed. But most importantly of all for my argument is this. Basic income increases the incentive to work. But you first got to realize that we need to reconceptualize what it is we mean by work. I mean, we have a crazy system that only labor counts. So if I pay you to look after my child, that's increased work. If you look after your own child, it diminishes work. It's both work. So we need to realize that we need to reconceptualize work. But the critical point is that means testing, which is what the governments have gone down, means that you create poverty traps. If you only pay to the poor, that means if they make an effort to go just above poverty and take low-wage jobs or whatever it is, they lose almost as much as they gain. So we've calculated, and many people have calculated, in many countries, the marginal tax rate in going from means-tested benefits into low-wage job is over 80%. Now, if anybody in this room were faced with a marginal tax rate of over 80%, you'd be rioting in some way. Right? But that's what we expect of the precariat, the reality. Even our ministers, in the cabinet ministers in Britain, admit that it's over 80%. So that is a disincentive. It's a disincentive to do low-wage jobs, but it's also an incentive to go into the black economy. And we have a real problem there that we don't talk about. So for me, a basic income, and we've got plenty of data showing it energizes people. It makes people more confident. It makes people more entrepreneurial in a small way or big way because they can take risks. And that's, in a way, the evidence is showing it increases work, not diminishes work. So I don't worry about that at all. It would actually energize people, but in a good way, in a good way.
Mr. Básica, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm all for increasing the progressivity of tax systems. I think part of the problem we've got in the world today is that our economies are creating greater divergence and a big gap between rich and poor. And our tax systems are making it worse. Because if you look at what's happened to tax systems in the last 20 years in most countries, they've lowered top rates, they've increased VAT, which is a very regressive tax. They've reduced corporate taxes. And so our tax systems have become less progressive and less redistributive over the last 20 years. But I also think that giving a basic income to rich people is a waste of money.
You can claw back through taxes.
Oh,
You
yeah?
can claw back with taxes.
So that's my problem.
That's-
And I think there are more efficient ways to transfer money to poor people. And I also think there's quite a lot more that can be done pre-distribution. So if you look at, just to give a small example in the UK, and we looked at a cohort at the London School of Economics of young people who were born in the 1990s who benefited from, at that point in time, 20% of young people were in poverty and 8% never finished school, and rates of teenage pregnancy and alcoholism were incredibly high. And over a period, the government spent more on schools, on programs targeting young people, on skills. And 20 years later, when you look at that cohort of children, most of them stayed in school. Child poverty was improved over that period. It's gotten worse since, but that's a different story. And teenage pregnancies and alcoholism fell by half. So early interventions can have huge impacts, and I would argue are much more cost effective than transferring income to people who don't need it.
Mr. Butterfield, I'm sorry that I didn't ask you questions, but listening to this conversation, and also you are a business leader, and you have to think how finance the whole project. If you have, I wonder if you have any idea how you can finance this basic income system.
So a lot of my motivations are similar, so political and ethical. But I think there is a strong economic argument to be made as well, and I've already said that I'm wary of concrete predictions. 6.5% is a significant increase, still probably less than the share of GDP in the US that's gone to increases in healthcare costs over the last 11 years or so. But I think there's a lot of productive capacity to be unlocked from, in the US, roughly, let's say, the bottom quartile, who have no opportunity to join the entrepreneurial ranks. So I was fortunate enough to grow up in a solidly middle-class family. I could make some mistakes. I could try some jobs and realize that's not for me, or just fail in them. I could borrow money. I could choose to take some time off and think about things as a young person. And most people can't do that. Most people are one error, one mistake away from homelessness. And this is a little bit of a digression, but I think the policies of tying help from the government to employment exacerbate that. Certainly in the US, healthcare being tied to employment, but also the earned income tax credit or wage subsidies, because then once you step out, even if it's for a very short time, you can be on the street, your children can lose their health care, and even Americans who do have health care often have, maybe a $3,000 deductible and in total $500 of savings. So any health incident is immediate, complete bankruptcy for those people. And so I think it's very difficult to predict what the long-term and the second and third order effects of these kinds of policy changes would be. But I would like to think that the creative ability, the intelligence, the gumption are about equally distributed among all people. And bringing more people into the participation will make a big difference. So I'm a believer in capitalism, and I'm a believer that you can create wealth. And if you have a quarter or a half of the population that is not able to create any of that wealth, then there's a real drag on the growth capacity, so the total rate by which you could grow. So 6.5% might turn out to look cheap, 10 years hence.
Interesting. But the country, I think the country like the United States has a strong values on the self-reliance and competitiveness, and this idea of government giving money to everybody in a kind of conflict with your.
So this is I'm happy to let others talk, but
right.
This is my favorite point because it's really just a garbage point, to be honest. So
yes.
I have plenty of money. If all I need to do is survive for the rest of my life, I could retire now. And do I? No, I still work exceptionally hard. If you look at the delegates here, there are many people who could afford to retire 1,000 times over, or 10,000 times over, 100,000 times over. And they're here, and they're working, and they work, in some cases, harder than average. They'll work 70-hour weeks. So there's something else going on besides once I get the minimum amount of money I need, I'm just going to play video games all day or something like that. But the second point is there's a lot of externalities which are completely invisible. And just one example, for very wealthy people, in safe countries, in Japan, in the United States, in the UK, you can walk down the street, and if you feel like buying something in a shop, you can tap your card, and it'll be handed over. And there's no fear of being kidnapped or robbed or being taken advantage of. And there's a huge investment that the government makes in just enforcement of a system of laws, in the court system, in contracts, which ultimately terminates with soldiers with machine guns and jail cells as the ultimate enforcement of that. Whereas if you had that kind of wealth in the 15th century, let's say, probably 5% or 10% of your wealth, not your income, but your wealth would go to preservation of that. So private armies and fortifications. There's a lot that in investment in the common that the benefits of which accrue primarily or solely to the rich.
Now, you mentioned that there's a less incentive for people to work, and well, there are some other ideas, but still believe that BI, basic income, will reduce the people's incentive to work?
Well, I think I understand there was an argument more basic income will stimulate the incentive for work. That's possible. And it depends on the condition of the testing procedure and so on. But I don't think it's going to be not so fruitful to talk about the efficiency of the basic income for the incentive for working, because we have to seriously consider about the priority and even optimization of the wealth policy. Even if the basic income will be able to stimulate the incentive for working, in case we have to spend more money for the equality of the opportunity rather than equality of the result. So which means that we might have to spend more money for the education or child care rather than just spending money to the everybody. That's a key issue, I think, which shouldn't pretty much focusing on the basic income's incentive to take care of the inspiration of the working. We have to discuss more precisely about the priority and optimization of the policy.
What do you think?
Well, I think Sato-san raises a very important point, which is what has happened to social mobility in our societies. And if you look, part of the deal was that people would tolerate some inequality if there was a sense that everyone got a fair chance. And when you look at what's happened to social mobility, what economists call the income elasticity of child to parent income, how much does your income depend on how much your parents' income was? That has gone up in most countries. So your economic outcomes are more likely to depend on how well off your parents were than 20 years ago. And that is a huge problem. And I think unless we start asking some difficult questions around why aren't we taxing wealth? What has happened to opportunities for mobility in our societies? And I think there's also a dangerous phenomenon that people who do succeed often engage in something that I call righteous meritocracy. I am successful because I am smart and I worked hard. And they don't acknowledge that I'm successful because I was born into a fortunate family and I went to some good schools and somebody got me an internship through a family friend. And because of all of those things, I became successful. And part of what we do in a society is share the benefits of good fortune. And we have gotten much less good at sharing the benefits of good fortune and acknowledging that there is an element of good luck in our outcomes. And righteous meritocracy actually is insulting to those who don't do well. So I think talking about social mobility, talking about taxing wealth would be a very good conversation to be having.
I would also like to add a note, of course, and I think all of us agree in principle with equality of opportunity. But there's a famous passage in a book written by Ralph Tawney in 1922 called Equality. And he has a passage about tadpoles and frogs. You can have many more tadpoles, but just occasionally one gets up and becomes a frog and croaks down at the others that you too can be up here. But the reality of our economy is that there are very few winners and there are a lot of losers. And if you equalized it, you might get a changed type of winner, but the structures are producing those inequalities. I'd like to come back to the point that we do have experiments now both in developing countries and rich industrialized countries. And when everybody talks about the cost, one should not forget the economic as well as social benefits of moving towards a basic income. Those experiments, for example, I'm just giving an example, where you've provided a basic income to a whole community, surprise, surprise, health improves. That puts less demand on health care expenditure. Surprise, surprise, schooling performance improves. A famous experiment in North Carolina that the children that had basic income by the time they were 16 were 1 year ahead of those that hadn't had the basic income. Okay, for similar backgrounds, controlling for backgrounds. The benefits mean that the net costs are not what you can do on the back of an envelope. You know, end this by end population, etc. And we've got to realize that at the moment, our existing means-tested and behavior-tested system is imposing incredible costs on the other part of our society. Crime, huge increase in crime has huge costs. If you have basic security, crime rates go down. It's in many respects moving towards a society where we actually provide basic security for all is a much more humane, whether you're a capitalist or a socialist. It gives people that breathing space where you can indulge in your creative passions. You can care for your elderly relatives who've got dementia or whatever because you don't feel under so much pressure. You can care for your community. You can look after the ecological reproduction of our commons. This is the sort of society we should be moving towards. And in that respect, something that is an unconditional economic right, you and me as a citizen of our community, I think is a powerful way forward. And then you can allow markets their proper place, etc. But if we don't move in that direction, I fear crime rates are continuing. Homelessness is a dramatic problem. I was in Tokyo and it's a problem everywhere.
Right.
And therefore, we've got to think creatively about moving towards something like a basic income.
I see. Well, we talk about the future. We're talking about the future. I want to go to the second important aspect, which is the future of jobs. And according to some reports, as you may already know, nearly 50% of existing human job will be replaced by technology and automation and artificial intelligence. And you, from your experience in Silicon Valley, what kind of impact do you see it coming up?
I think I might be a little bit of an outlier when we think about the impact. So absolutely, individuals and individual occupations and populations will be impacted from an inconvenient level to an extremely disruptive level. The net over the long run, though, we have 4,000 years of history that show us people's roles change. And we don't stop. There wasn't a set amount of stuff that we want to make as a species. And once we make that amount of stuff, we just stop. We just can't make more stuff. So let me give you one example of that.
Okay.
There's a 1960 movie, The Apartment, an American movie, Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. And Jack Lemmon's character works as probably some kind of actuarial work in an insurance company. And there's rows and columns of desks that stretch out on this floor, and he has an electromagnetic adding machine, and he has a typewriter, and he receives reams of paper from people pushing a cart by, and he does some calculations, and he types up his results, and he puts that on the cart to go off. So what is he? He is a cell in a spreadsheet. I mean, he's literally exactly a cell in the spreadsheet, and that was close to 70 years ago, 60 years ago. The insurance industry in the United States employs about the same number of people. There hasn't been any real diminishment of that. what happened as a result? They're more productive on a per employee basis. They're more profitable. The insurance companies in the insurance system is more efficiently run. It's less prone to disasters. They're more accurate in their modeling. So no one is doing that job anymore. No one does arithmetic for a living at an insurance company, but no one lost their job. And when I say 4,000 years of history, I mean like the development of chemical fertilizers probably put half of the world's population out of work. It just happened over the course of a couple generations. And we've seen that over and over and over again. So people are in the Silicon Valley, because of the rise of autonomous vehicles, are very worried about truck driver populations. I think that's going to happen much slower than we think. And those jobs, which are very good jobs for the level of education that's required, so I think they provide an opportunity for economic mobility, which is becoming rarer and rarer in the United States. Those jobs are at risk over the long run. But I don't think that we will top out with the amount of goods or services that we're producing now will just continue to increase.
Do you think unemployment will go up because of the artificial intelligence?
Well, I mean, it never has, right? I mean, Japan's a wonderful example. Meiji Restoration was a very large transformation to the entire culture and the society, but certainly economically. And if you look over the last 150 years of Japanese history, no one does the same thing. I mean, the number of rice farmers is 95% reduction or something like that.
Why do you think, again, the basic income is needed?
Well, I don't know that it's needed. I would say it's absolutely worth experimenting with, and it seems likely to be successful, to produce outcomes that are successful on the policy side. I would absolutely agree with Manish that there's a bunch of other change which would be very important for us, and principle among them when we look at inequality, I think, the differential tax on labor versus capital. I mean, you can build any kind of model you want, run any kind of simulation you want, run it 100,000 times, run it 1,000,000 times, tweak the parameters. If you tax labor more than capital and let it run for generation after generation after generation, as we've seen for the last 100 years, the results will be the same every time. I mean, that's a very simple change in the sense of what it takes to understand it. Difficult change in the implementation, I'm sure. But basic income is not going to be a panacea. I don't think it's going to solve everything. There's a set of policy changes that would associate. But I do think we all share, and certainly one of the reasons for this forum in the first place is moving towards a more equitable world, moving towards more equality of opportunity, and reducing, I hadn't heard that term before, but reducing the population in the precariat, reducing the number of economically vulnerable people in the world. I'll finish this off with one quick quote. There's John Quincy Adams, third president of the United States, I think. And then I'm going to butcher this, so this is a paraphrase. He said, "I must study politics and war so that my sons may study naval architecture and commerce, so that their sons may study tapestry and porcelain." So those are pretty antiquated terms, but the point, and I think we've seen a little bit of this in the 19th and 20th century, and what we're seeing today in the early 21st century, is we move from trying to sort ourselves out into some sort of political organization, and there's a lot of war that goes along with that. We develop economically to a level where there's sufficient productive capacity that people don't starve to death, which has been the fate of humans for the last couple 100,000 years, periodic starvation. And then we have to decide what we want as a species, what's important to us. Is creativity, artistic expression, spiritual fulfillment? And certainly we're not going to, I hope, be talking as a species about GDP growth as the primary indicator of economic or policy success 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now.
Well, sounds great, but some critics, harsh critics, saying that the reason why Silicon Valley is pushing that idea, basic income, is because they want to accelerate, the automation of works and for their own, business interest.
Yes, I'm not sure that that's a fair criticism. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not a good representative in the sense that I don't share that set of beliefs. What's that movie called? Wall-E, a Pixar movie.
Wall-E, yes.
Yeah, so it has the vision of the future where people drink soda pops and float around on sofa chairs and just become very fat and are entertained to death. I think that world is very unlikely to ever come about, thankfully.
May I come in?
Go, sure.
Because I think one has to also take account that the technological changes are transforming the labor process. Within the next 10 years, 1 in every 3 labor transactions will be done online. It will not be an employer-employee relationship. It's already multiplying enormously. So basically you're having a globalization of the labor market, which is driving down wages in the OECD countries, because the world's labor supply has quadrupled in the last 20 years, all from countries with living standards and wages way below what exists in the United States or Europe. In the same time, if you've got this growth of online labor, you've also got a phenomenon which is not yet getting the attention it deserves, called heteromation. Heteromation, where the technologies are generating extra demands on us to do work that is not counted as labor. If you're in the precariat, you have to do a hell of a lot of work for which you get no compensation at all. Try applying for 1,000 jobs before you get 1 interview, which is what many people have to do. But the algorithms mean for the employers there's no cost. You go through a whole lot of tests, uses up vast amount of time, it's work. And there are lots of other examples. And I think we have to think about compensating people in a different way from traditional ways.
I see. Well, talking about the job insecurity, I'm sure you was proposing or proposing some ideas on your report about job security, what's happening in Europe now, and that can be good to introduce.
Yes, I mean, I think automation, past periods of automation have not been associated with reduced employment. That the electrification revolution, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know about this one. I mean, the best study I've seen has looked at what's happened in US manufacturing as a result of automation and did find some loss of net employment in those communities. But it's still early days in this AI machine learning revolution, so we don't know. I am sort of in the camp that I think the nature of jobs will change rather than jobs will disappear. And so I think we need to rethink our labor market institutions to cope with a world in which those jobs will change. So I think some of the most interesting ideas are, for example, what's done in Denmark and in the Netherlands, which they call flexicurity, which means that it has 3 key elements. First, it's very easy for employers to hire and fire workers, but if a worker, the second element is if a worker loses their job, they get very generous unemployment insurance, which covers 90% of their previous wage for up to 2 years. But the third key element is they have to participate in what are called active labor market policies to retrain and reskill. And if they don't find a job, the state will find them a job after a certain period. So you have a flexible labor market, but you also provide security to the worker that they will get a decent income and be retrained for a new job in the future. And I think in a world in which the labor market is changing a lot and the nature of jobs is changing a lot, something like that is very attractive. I think the other piece that's very attractive is thinking much more creatively about part-time work. So if parts of, if you think that the routine and repetitive parts of all of our jobs could be automated, there'll be a part of the job left which is more creative and human and interesting. And maybe you could do that 3 days a week. And if your benefits were pro rata adjusted to working part-time, that could be quite an attractive proposition. But many labor markets around the world really discriminate against part-time work and make it very unattractive and precarious. And we should find a way to make part-time work more attractive to cope with automation.
I think Mr. Sato would probably have something to add, but in Japan there are some big organizations like yours announced that they're going to replace tens of thousands of routine work by introducing
exactly
AI and transform automation. Now, that means that the future that we just discussed is already happening.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But do you have some solution to that?
Well, I think her opinion is quite correct from my point of view, because there's obvious AI will take over the job of the human beings. No doubt, it's happening already. But issue is the quality of the labor. even if we lose the current job because of the AI era, but still there are so many things, the jobs which is suitable for the human beings, which needs the human beings' labor. Something like service industry is also very, I think, human beings oriented. So there are some areas human being has to do. But importance is that we need retrain of the labor. Otherwise, we may not be able to live on. So in order to have the retrain of the labor or even human beings, we need recurrent education system. That's very important for the future at the era of AI. So can I say just final word on that? AI, BI, CI. We shouldn't be controlled by AI, and we shouldn't too much rely on BI. And we should have CI, which means continuous improvement of intangible asset of human beings.
Well, AI, BI, CI. Yeah, we should remember today. The good, but I'm sorry we are running out of time. Now, on the final words, we want to ask you, everybody, to briefly, what do you think, what we need to think about the most to create better and brighter future? Starting with you, sir.
It's a tough one to start on. I think a lot of the policy changes that we've discussed today are important, so including basic income, moving towards a world where there is more participation in entrepreneurial activity, but also in creative activity generally, where there are fewer people who have that stress that you talked about, that are put in a position where there's no sustained enjoyment of life really possible, where there's overarching concerns about taking care of their children or their other relatives or even themselves. It certainly sounds like a brighter future to me, where there's more participation. And we have, as a species, done very well moving from collecting our 2,000 calories a day to a world where we have more or less, not necessarily equitably distributed, more or less infinite calories available. And what are we to do? You know, hopefully we start to answer those questions a little bit more than the basic economic questions.
I see. Thank you. Mr. Sato?
Oh, yes. I think we human beings cannot live just only for honor or wealth. So, and the World Economic Forum, I think the data, there's the explanation about the ikigai in Japanese, which means that ikigai is in English how to live or what the purpose to live. Okay, this ikigai's concept comes from the answer from four important questions. One, what do you love? And two, what are you good at? The third, what does the world need from you? The fourth, what can you get paid for? So to answering the question, these four important questions, that's a concept of ikigai, Japanese. So I think in order to have better society, we have to individually, we have to spend our best effort to have that kind of ikigai. And also, that's very important, we have to create our structure, the society, who will be able to allow us to get into to seeking for this ikigai values for the future. So that's the, I think, quite general, I think, tendency to go. And you may say, I'm a dreamer, but it's not the only one.
Oh, may say.
Where have we heard that?
Beautiful, beautiful. Imagine. So, what do you think?
Well, I think societies, all societies have ways to take care of people who are young, who are old, and who fall on hard times. And all societies organize that through some combination of the family, the community, the state, and the market. And those four elements are what we think of as the welfare state. And I think our current welfare state is not working for the new economy, and we need a fundamental rethink of how those elements of the family, the community, the state, and the market can cope with this new automated, digital 21st century economy. And I think there is no doubt that we need more resources, and we need to figure out how to generate more tax revenues through progressive taxation to finance a better welfare state, better suited to the 21st century.
Our time is already running out. Just one word. Thank you. Last word.
Yeah, I think I go back to the original point. I think a good society thinks from the position of the most vulnerable, which I believe are the precariat. And in that regard, remember, freedom is vital for those people. A social policy is only just if it increases the freedom of these people. A social policy is only just if it increases the security of people. And what I've argued is that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value, because it has emancipatory qualities. The existing means testing, conditionality, all of that stuff restricts freedom for the very people who are most vulnerable in our societies. So if we want a good society, we must look for the security and freedoms of the precariat.
Great. Time's up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.